It was a series of murders that would defy human comprehension.
This is the worst case of serial killing in Australia's history.
The revelations about the case would captivate and shock the nation.
It's the stuff of horror movies.
Torture, electrocution, decapitation, and at one stage, cannibalism.
For the first time, we hear from the man who led the police investigation.
All of the barrels were full of body parts. The difficulty was, how many bodies did we have there?
And in a world exclusive, we reveal the footage taken by detectives as they entered the infamous bank vault for the first time. This is Snowtown, and the bodies in the barrels murders were crimes that shook Australia. Sometimes, the most shocking crimes can start with a less significant case, an almost inconsequential inquiry that prompts an inquisitive detective to delve a little deeper. That was certainly the case with a routine missing persons inquiry in Adelaide, which would uncover a tale of torture, cold-blooded murder, and lead to Australia's most prolific serial killer.
There was an officer in charge of the police major crime section, Paul Shram, who instigated a system in the major crime branch that when detectives had some downtime, which was rare, they would have a look at old missing persons cases. So cases that had perhaps sat idle for a while. They're never closed, but perhaps had sat idle for a while.
I'd only just gone to major crime investigation branch, and the missing persons section came under the same branch structure. So I asked the missing persons section to choose 10 files that they thought were most worthy of a review.
The reason he did that was that people who disappear really only disappear for 3 reasons, generally, and one is that they've chosen to, another is that they've taken their own life, and the third is that they've met with foul play. And when that possibility can never be discounted, then a missing persons case is always worth looking at and considering.
One of those files was a chap called Clinton Trezise.
Clinton Trezise was a down-on-his-luck young man who had spent most of his childhood in foster care. He disappeared in 1992 and wasn't reported missing for 3 years.
There wasn't really anything to go on. The usual trails had gone cold soon after his disappearance. Things like transactions in his bank account, they weren't occurring. Some of his possessions had disappeared at the time he did from his flat. A lot of people disappear in that way for whatever reason, and so it was a difficult case. While that was happening, there was another missing persons case that came to the attention of the missing persons unit, which worked side by side with the major crime branch. And that was a person called Barry Lane, who vanished and was reported missing by his family. And it became clear to the police fairly quickly that there was a link between Trezise and Lane, that they were associates.
Clinton Trezise had actually been living with Barry Lane in the early 1990s, and the pair had become close friends. Rumours swirling around Adelaide's northern suburbs even suggested there was a physical relationship between them.
Barry Lane was a bizarre, warped character. He was a pedophile. He was a predator. He had no redeeming features.
The detectives started to look into the background of those two people. And what we learned very early was that they were on a disability pension. their disability pension was still being drawn down at various ATMs. Traditionally, when you look at a missing persons file, if that is happening, it may indicate that the person is still alive.
Investigators searched Barry Lane's bank account, which revealed that regular withdrawals were being made. For a missing person, that was naturally suspicious, but what was more unusual was that most were being made from a service station north of Adelaide.
Surveillance cameras were installed, watching that particular bank machine at that particular service station. And pretty early on, pretty soon after those cameras were installed, police were able to obtain footage of a person making withdrawals from Barry Lane's bank account. Only it wasn't Barry Lane. And so that left police with a task to determine who that was, and they were able to do that pretty quickly, and that person was Robert Wagner.
Police discovered that Wagner was a friend of Barry Lane's, and now he'd been spotted taking money from the missing man's bank account. 2 weeks later, he was seen doing the same thing again. With Lane now missing for over 6 months, police decided to follow Robert Wagner, and the trail led to the home of a man who also knew Barry Lane. His name was John Bunting.
They had been seen and were known to have frequented each other's homes, hung around in the same areas. The epicentre of that at the time was 203 Waterloo Corner Road at Salisbury North, which is where John Bunting was living with his then wife. And so the names John Bunting and Robert Wagner came up very early in those missing persons investigations.
The pieces of the jigsaw were slowly falling into place. The more police searched, the more links they found between John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and missing people in Adelaide's northern suburbs. Slowly, a sinister tale was beginning to emerge, and in November 1998, it took another ominous turn.
At about that same time, Elizabeth Hayden was reported missing.
When police visited Hayden's home looking for the missing woman, they interviewed her husband, Mark. He claimed the marriage was over and his wife had left. His statement also mentioned another man who had often visited the house, John Bunting. Suspicions of foul play had always surrounded the missing persons cases since the review had started months earlier. But now, detectives were genuinely concerned that there was much more to this than just missing people. Their worst fears were realized when they made a chance discovery at Elizabeth Hayden's home.
They learned that there'd been a four-wheel drive, a Land Cruiser, that had been parked in her driveway. Some neighbours had seen it being loaded up, and it disappeared.
The witness account described Bunting and Wagner loading garbage bags into a four-wheel drive at about the time she disappeared.
The Land Cruiser was important to our investigation because it had disappeared from Elizabeth Hayden's premises at about the same time as she'd gone missing. So it was important to find out, had she met foul play, had she been conveyed in this particular vehicle, what was the relationship with her disappearance?
The Land Cruiser represented a vital clue, the first breakthrough that would eventually lead police to the infamous bank vault and its gruesome contents.
John Bunting, Mark Hayden and Robert Wagner were all interviewed separately, and they all provided a different account as to what had happened to that Land Cruiser, where it had gone and how it had been disposed of. So that immediately rang bells with the police. It became a vehicle that we needed to urgently find.
Bunting and Wagner were soon linked to yet another missing person when the 1996 disappearance of Suzanne Allen was re-investigated. Her file was littered with connections to both men, including the two of them being spotted loading her furniture into a truck around the time she was reported missing.
Throughout the review, gradually the names John Bunting and Robert Wagner just kept coming up as police were making routine inquiries into what had happened to these people. Whether it was as someone who had known them, a friend, had lived with them, or just had made a statement about the missing person's last known movements, those names, John Bunting and Robert Wagner, kept coming up, and eventually that meant they were a focus.
By February 1999, the disappearances of Clinton Trezise, Barry Lane, Elizabeth Hayden and Suzanne Allen were all classified as major crimes. Only a few months later, a fifth name was added to the list, a former lover of Suzanne Allen called Ray Davies, who hadn't been seen since 1995. Police began to link more and more disappearances with the names Bunting and Wagner. But what detectives didn't yet realise was that a trail of missing people across Adelaide's northern suburbs would lead them 150 kilometres to an isolated country town. And Snowtown would become forever associated with one of Australia's most barbaric killers. In February 1999, detectives investigating the disappearances of 5 people were focusing their attentions on Adelaide's northern suburbs, the area where the missing people were last seen alive.
Adelaide then, as it is today, is a great place to live and do business. Great scenery, beaches, wine, second to none in the world. But like other cities, some of the lower socio-economic areas do have slightly higher unemployed youth.
There were families for whom employment was unthought of. So it wasn't a case of people wanted to get jobs and couldn't get them, but rather there were whole communities in which it was unthinkable to hold a job.
And with that, you get crime.
Detectives were beginning to strengthen the links between the 5 missing people. Many were having money taken from their bank accounts by strangers. But what was more worrying was that they were all linked to the same 2 individuals, Robert Wagner and John Bunting.
John Bunting didn't have a criminal history, nothing that was serious. There were no serious assaults or anything like that, just minor matters. Robert Wagner, the same, nothing serious.
John Bunting grew up in the suburb of Inala. His parents were good, honest people, and they loved him and they cared for him. But he showed some really concerning traits as a child from very early on, and one of those was the pleasure he used to take in killing things. It started with insects, and he'd experiment with dropping insects into different types of acids or chemicals and see how quickly they died. And as he got older, as a teenager and a young adult, he took a bit more pleasure than you would expect from killing animals and things like that. So there were some early signs that this was a fella who was definitely not right. As he grew a bit older, he also developed an interest in Nazism and white supremacy, to the point where he read a copy of Mein Kampf and upset his mum by painting a swastika on the inside of his car boot. But by his own account, he also suffered a horrible moment of sexual abuse at the hands of a brother's friend, where he was sexually assaulted, or so he would tell years later. And I think that that had a significant impact on him as well.
Wagner was also sexually abused as a young man. Bunting, to some extent, also preyed on that vulnerability. Wagner was very much Bunting's henchman. He was a tall man and provided Bunting with the physical backup that he needed. He needed someone who wouldn't question him or challenge him. Wagner fulfilled that role.
As police attempted to untangle the complex web of missing people that surrounded Bunting and Wagner, their attention focused on Elizabeth Hayden. She was reported missing by her brother on the 25th of November 1998, and she hadn't been seen since.
Elizabeth Hayden was the wife of Mark Hayden. She was not a particularly intelligent person. She had endured a difficult life, and she was someone who existed at close quarters with John Bunting because he was friends with her husband, and she eventually began to irritate John Bunting. He found Elizabeth Hayden irritating, and Mark Hayden obviously developed a dislike for his wife. Mark Hayden is a down-on-your-luck kind of guy. He's a working-class person, not very intelligent at all. And Bunting, like he would with other people, would hold court with Mark Hayden, talk to him about things he'd done, boast about violent things he'd done or crimes he'd committed. And Mark Hayden was a weak and an easily led person and quickly fell under John Bunting's spell.
On the 6th of February 1999, what started as a straightforward missing persons case review was reclassified as a major crime. This meant police investigating the 5 disappearances were given more resources, and investigators stepped up the surveillance of the 2 men at the heart of the police operation.
At this stage of the investigation, we had sufficient evidence to go to a judge and to get some telephone intercepts, some listening device warrants. The detectives who were investigating the case were contacted by our surveillance section, who were surveilling Mr. Wagner and Mr. Bunting, and we found that they were heading to Snowtown.
Snowtown's a small rural community about an hour and a half north of Adelaide. Population, I think, in the low hundreds. It's probably full of mostly retirees and farmers from the surrounding district.
Now, this was the first time that Snowtown had come to our attention. We'd learned that there was a person living in Snowtown that they were visiting. So it was that time of the investigation that we thought we should pay Snowtown a visit. When the detectives arrived at Snowtown in Railway Terrace, there was a lot of cars in varying stages of disrepair in the front yard. And to their surprise, there was the missing Land Cruiser that we'd been looking for all over Australia. So that was a significant step in the investigation. Now we had a link between Bunting and Hayden and Wagner and the Land Cruiser.
The Land Cruiser found in Snowtown was last seen at Elizabeth Hayden's house in Adelaide 6 months earlier. Given that it had disappeared at the same time as her, police were keen to find out where it had been.
So we opted to go and speak to the owner of the premises, and he told them that, in fact, that person knew Mr. Bunting, Mr. Wagner, and a person called Hayden, and that, in fact, these people had rented an old bank building in Snowtown. They then told the detectives that there had been some large black barrels that had been kept in the Land Cruiser, and those large black barrels had been moved into the bank vault.
It was an old, small country bank, disused, apart from being used now for storage of old electrical items, computers and things like that were broken. So once we got in, the side door leads you into the now vacant sort of kitchen meal area of the bank. To the right of that was another door that takes you in to the area behind the bank counters. The vault door was then just to the left as you went in behind the counter. Once we got the door open, we were confronted with just a solid wall of black plastic that was sticky taped or adhesive tape all the way around.
Now we can reveal never-before-seen footage filmed as detectives entered the infamous bank vault for the very first time.
So they undid the tape, just peered into the darkness of the vault, and they filmed 6 large black barrels, packets of rubber gloves, some bottles of acid.
It was my first week on call, and I received a phone call from a major crime police officer who said, "Evening, Doc. I'm in a little place called Snowtown in a bank vault. It's lined by plastic and there are all these barrels." And so I said, "Well, is it hydroponic or drugs or something?" He said, "No, it doesn't smell like that." And then he said, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, why don't you just open a barrel and have a look and phone me with the results?"
When I took the lid off the first barrel, I could see what appeared to be a mummified foot that was sort of sticking up. I could see the sole of the foot. There was dirty clothing and a hunched up item sort of filling 3/4 of this barrel.
And about 5 minutes later, he phoned back and said there are human remains in them.
I think at that stage we were all shocked. We knew as the case was developing that it was more probable that we were dealing with a homicide investigation, but it wasn't until we saw what was in the barrels as to it was definitely a murder investigation. We could see that there were body parts, and as the other lids were lifted off of the barrels, all of the barrels were full of body parts. The difficulty was, how many bodies did we have there?
Police in South Australia had made a gruesome discovery inside a bank vault in Snowtown, 150 kilometres north of Adelaide. In May 1999, 6 barrels containing a number of body parts were found, and police realised that a missing persons investigation, which had begun 2 years earlier, may well have just ended inside the disused bank.
Firstly, we didn't know how many bodies were there. We could see that there were a lot of body parts, so we knew it was going to be a complex job for the forensic pathologists to literally piece it together. We also wanted to know who these people were. Were they the missing people who had already been reported, or were there other people who in fact had never been reported missing?
As the forensic team got to work, detectives arrested John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden, the men linked to all the missing people. All 3 refused to say anything to the arresting officers. Immediately after the arrests, a press conference prompted phone calls into the police department.
We received a lot of calls from Crime Stoppers, but one in particular was of particular interest. And that call basically said, "We think that you should go out to Salisbury North to a particular address because we think that you'll find a body out there." We used ground penetrating radar, which told us whether or not soil had been disturbed. And under a tank stand, we found such a place. So we commenced to dig there, and about 1 metre down, we discovered a number of plastic bags, which we subsequently learned to be the remains of Susan Allen.
Only hours later, yet another body was found at the address in Salisbury North. The skeletal remains of Ray Davies, who'd been missing since 1995, were found buried in a disused cellar, and the name of the last known resident at the address came as no surprise to the police.
The address where the bodies were found, Ray Davies and Susan Allen, was where John Bunting had been living.
As investigations continued at the house in Salisbury North, the police forensic teams carried on the grim task of determining who was contained inside the barrels retrieved from the Snowtown bank vault.
So one by one, we brought the bodies, still in the barrels, into the mortuary and took the lid off, and then we decanted the fluid, which left the remains. And then we basically just reached in and took the bodies and the body parts out. Now, it was like a a grotesque jigsaw puzzle in a way. They had used acid to try and dissolve the bodies, but you need a lot of acid to dissolve bodies. And bodies have a tremendous percentage of water content, and so the water really neutralised the acid. So the bodies were just sitting in this almost sterile, oxygen-deprived environment, and that's why we could actually get some identification. There were tattoos present. There were fingerprints still that could be taken. And also, we could see some of the methods that it used to kill these victims. We had 3 cases that had ropes around their neck, and so that suggests that they were strangled with the ropes. They also had gags. There was also evidence of maltreatment. One of the victims had handcuffs still on. There were some thumb cuffs present in the barrel with him. One of the victims certainly had burns across the chest, and a couple of them had blackened areas, I think one on the scrotum and one on the feet, that could have been from burns as well.
What had begun as an investigation into 5 missing people had turned into a multiple murder inquiry. Police had already established that 2 of the 5 were dead. With the 3 remaining individuals still unaccounted for, detectives were shocked when the forensic team reported there were actually 8 bodies contained in the barrels. Were the 3 missing people among them? And if so, who were the others? Just days after the arrests of the 3 suspects, Robert Wagner, John Bunting and Mark Hayden, detectives would find out the answer.
We'd become aware in the investigation up to this point in time that there was a young man called Jamie Vlasakis, who was an associate of the other offenders.
The identity of Jamie Vlasakis is still protected by a court-issued suppression order.
Jamie Vlasakis, like a lot of people in this story, was a person who endured a horrific childhood. He was a young man who was born into a troubled family, whose father sexually abused him and then died when he was very young.
At that point in his life, John Bunting walked in. John Bunting became a huge part of his life. He became the father he never had.
Like so many other people that John Bunting exerted influence over, he was a shining light. He was a way out. He was a rescuer, a white knight, if you like. And that was the dynamic early on between them.
So Jamie Vlasakis was right there, watching and listening as these events started to unfold. And as he grew older and became more useful, John Bunting involved him in these crimes.
Over the course of several interviews, culminating in a 2,000-page statement, Vlasakis would recount a tale of death and destruction spanning almost 8 years. He would also go on to implicate someone else in the killings, himself.
With that knowledge, and under the weight of guilt and shame and despair, he began detailing what he knew about all of the murders that predated his involvement, and then all of the murders that he took part in or was a witness to in some way. And what that did was provide police with a roadmap to this entire series of crimes.
His statement would form the basis of the biggest criminal investigation in Australian history. From the first murder until the last, Vlasakis laid out who the victims were and how and why they had died, starting with Bunting's first victim, Clinton Trezise.
Clinton Trezise was murdered by John Bunting. He was attacked inside John Bunting's house at Salisbury North. He was knocked down and he was attacked with a hammer and he had his skull caved in.
Ray Davies, found buried in the garden of Bunting's house, was murdered in 1995 because he was suspected of abusing children. It emerged that Vlasakis' mother had helped in the killing. Suzanne Allen, also found buried at the house, died a year later. Bunting and Wagner admitted cutting up her body. Vlasakis could also put names to the bodies found in the barrels. To the shock of the detectives, those names included the killer's own family members.
There was a suggestion by Jamie Vlasakis that his brother Troy Yude had molested him when he was young, and that angered John Bunting. He was at home, he was in his bedroom, when Bunting, Wagner Vlasakis and Hayden all turned up at the house, and then took him into the bathroom where he endured horrific acts of torture, burns, toes crushed with pliers, and was eventually murdered in there.
As the horrific tale unfolded, the scale of depravity got worse. Fred Brooks vanished in September 1998. His mother had had a relationship with Bunting, and he wrongly suspected that Fred was a paedophile.
The murder of Fred Brooks was truly horrific. It was very possibly one of, if not the most horrific of all of these crimes. He endured unspeakable acts of torture before he was finally murdered. He was burnt with cigarettes, he had his toes crushed with pliers, he even had a lit sparkler forced down the eye of the penis, and he was restrained as it burned down towards his own flesh. It was a truly horrific, enduring moment of torture, and so when he was finally murdered, it was probably some point of relief for a young man who must have known that he was going to die.
Friends, too, died at the hands of the cold-blooded killers. Michael Gardiner died in September 1997 because Robert Wagner found his homosexuality offensive. Gavin Porter, an acquaintance of Jamie Vlasakis, was strangled to death in April 1998 because his drug addiction meant Bunting deemed him a waste. Gary O'Dwyer was targeted in October 1998, simply because Bunting said it had been a while since he'd killed anyone. There was also a sense that people were murdered as the killers covered their tracks, or they had simply outlived their usefulness.
Barry Lane was a known pedophile. I think it was because of that background that made Lane a target for Bunting.
Bunting knew what Barry Lane was, in his own mind, right from the start. But he tolerated Barry Lane because he wanted information from him about other people he knew, other pedophiles, people that Bunting wanted to pinpoint, punish, maybe even kill. So John Bunting used Barry Lane for information, and when he was done, or when he could no longer tolerate Barry Lane, he killed him. Thomas Trevelyan was involved in the murder of Barry Lane and helped dispose of Barry Lane's body. Thomas Trevelyan was a marked man from that point on because his behaviour was so erratic and so unstable that there was a risk that he would tell people about what had happened, and Wagner and Bunting knew that, and they killed him by hanging him to make it look like a suicide.
Elizabeth Hayden, the wife of Mark Hayden, whose disappearance ignited the investigation, was also found in Snowtown. Killed because Bunting thought she knew too much. Her death marked a slowing in the pace of the killings as the police operation intensified. Tragically, the 12th and final victim was murdered as the net closed in on the killers.
David Johnson was Jamie Vlasakis' stepbrother.
David Johnson had an interest in computers. He wanted to buy a new computer. And he was told that there was a computer for sale at Snowtown.
But that computer didn't exist. He was lured there, and when he was taken inside that bank building, he was ambushed by Robert Wagner and John Bunting.
He was tortured into giving his PIN number of his credit card. Several of the offenders were sent off to a nearby town to test whether or not the information was in fact correct. And when they returned to the vault, in fact, David Johnson had been murdered by Bunting.
Just 11 days after Johnson was killed, police entered the vault of the bank for the first time and discovered the barrels. Now, with the victims identified, for the police the question remained what could possibly have motivated these murders. The answer to that lay in the dark and twisted mind of John Bunting. John Bunting and his accomplices Robert Wagner, Mark Hayden and Jamie Vlasakis had been charged with multiple counts of murder, after police were convinced that they lay at the centre of a web of torture and sadism that had resulted in the deaths of 12 people. The question that would overshadow any trial: what could have motivated the killers?
The key to what happened with these murders is Mr. Bunting. I mean, he sits at the centre of it.
He had a hatred of people, pedophiles, homosexuals, and in fact, he was inferring that was one of the reasons as to why he was committing these murders.
Bunting held himself out as a vigilante in relation to pedophiles.
In his bedroom, for example, there on the wall there is this extraordinary plan or map with coloured wool going between all the points, and this is supposed to be the web with all of the connections between these people he's identified as paedophiles. He believes when he walks down the street that he can just see someone and know they're a child molester.
Of course, as we subsequently learned, most of the people who were victims in this horrific crime weren't in that category, and clearly that wasn't the total reason as to why Bunting was committing these murders.
As his crimes unfolded, he killed people for the sake of killing people. The first murder is a quick attack with a hammer. He caves in the skull of his victim. By the time you get to the 6th, 7th murder in this crime series, John Bunting is binding people, torturing them, crushing their toes with pliers, burning them with cigarette lighters and sparklers. John Bunting loved to inflict pain. He enjoyed torturing his victims, and it culminated in the bit that he relished the most, and that was killing them, taking their life.
But what exactly enabled John Bunting to manipulate and even encourage his associates to commit such shocking crimes?
Bunting clearly had an ability to attract certain kinds of people, to convince them, and to establish himself as a powerful leader within that group. But you've got to remember, the group that he established himself within, they're a very vulnerable bunch of people.
He surrounded himself by the weak, the vulnerable, and those who'd been abused.
People who are desperately looking for someone, really, to look after them. He's someone who takes great delight in power over other people. Not just power over his followers, but when you look at the terrible torture and killing that went on, this wasn't simple murder. These were the most dreadful, extended sessions of torture. And that's also about exerting power and control.
Police investigating the bodies in the barrels case, as it was now dubbed, had uncovered what they alleged were 12 brutal murders. Now, in December 2000, the committal hearing began. Designed to test all the evidence before trial by jury, the process would involve almost 70 witnesses.
There was an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of evidence that we had against these offenders. Something like 2,000 witness statements, almost 5,000 exhibits.
6 months into the committal hearing, and with the whole of Australia, if not the world, watching, news broke of a dramatic development in the case. On Thursday, the 19th of June 2001, Jamie Vlasakis pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced in Adelaide Supreme Court to 26 years for his part in the killings. He accepted his punishment and went on to become the star witness against his co-accused.
Whilst we had lots of pieces of evidence, Jamie Vlasakis was the storyteller. Jamie Vlasakis could tell the story of how this could possibly happen. He put the personalities into the equation. He could tell us the whys, not just what happened, but why it happened and how this could happen. Yes, of course it was to his advantage that he assisted. Yes, it meant he got a lesser sentence. But I believe that he was also personally motivated by guilt and a desire to actually do the right thing.
After years of legal arguments, the trial of John Bunting and Robert Wagner began on the 16th of October 2002. Both men were charged with numerous counts of murder. Mark Hayden was charged with 2 counts of murder and several counts of assisting an offender. He would face trial separately.
When John Bunting and Robert Wagner stood in the dock in court, almost always, their mood and their appearance was defiant. They were not people who looked like they had any remorse in any way. They were not people who looked like they were emotionally overcome by the things that they'd done or by hearing about it again. They were defiant.
The prosecution's case was as convincing as it was shocking. Forensic evidence found in the bank placed Bunting, Wagner and Hayden inside the vault in contact with both the bodies and a variety of weapons and tools used to torture and dismember their victims. They could also prove that Bunting and Hayden had rented the bank vault, and financial records illustrated that the trio had gone to great lengths to steal their victims' money. But perhaps the most chilling evidence was found on a series of audio cassettes uncovered during the investigation.
We were partway through the trial. We had a phone call from the police saying they had something that we needed to hear.
And that was a tape recording which purported to be the voice of Susan Allen. And when that was played, it was basically saying, don't worry about me, I've found a boyfriend and I've gone overseas. And in fact, we found some witnesses later on that had listened to that tape in a telephone call, and they believed it to be the missing person. So that did influence police's belief that in fact she was still alive. We of course subsequently found out that that was part of their method of operation.
He would make them read certain things out and say certain things which were recorded, and then these were put together so as to make what appeared to be phone messages to friends and relatives from the person who was now dead.
Given their graphic nature, the audio recordings have never been publicly released.
And also, of course, he extracted information from them about their pensions and their bank cards and things like that. So there was a small element of the pragmatic thief, but a large element of the vile sadist.
During the trial, the jury had to hear about the most horrific details in terms of what happened to these victims. That involved torture, electrocution, decapitation, and at one stage cannibalism.
It was following the final murder in this crime spree, and that was the murder of David Johnson. And Robert Wagner and John Bunting removed a portion of his flesh in the bank vault at Snowtown and took it across the road in a plastic glove to their friend's house and told him that they had some roo meat to cook. And they fried this piece of flesh in a fry pan on the stove and cut it up and served it not only to themselves but also this friend of theirs. And he ate it and they ate it, and it was a disturbing moment, but the friend didn't know what it was.
The prosecution rested their case after 174 days of arduous and extremely graphic detail. In comparison, the defence team contesting the charges took just 18 minutes. If the court or the media expected to hear any revelations from the killers themselves, they would be disappointed.
At the conclusion of the prosecution case, each of the accused were entitled to give evidence. Both elected not to give evidence and remained silent.
On Monday, the 8th of September, 2003, the jury reached their verdicts. Bunting and Wagner were found guilty on all counts, except the murder of Suzanne Allen. On that count, they couldn't reach a verdict. Bunting and Wagner claimed that she had died of natural causes and they had buried her. The evidence wasn't solid enough to prove otherwise.
The judge commented that they had been involved in killing for pleasure. There was little likelihood of their rehabilitation. So 2 of the offenders, Mr Bunting and Mr Wagner, were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
The jury verdicts confirm Bunting and Wagner as Australia's worst serial killers. Theirs was a remorseless and relentless campaign of murder.
In my view, Justice Martin adopted the only course that was really open to him. The crimes that were committed were so horrific, so beyond human comprehension, that these men can never be released back into the community.
Mark Hayden was eventually convicted of assisting in the murders. The jury were not satisfied that he had been involved in the murders himself, but were satisfied that he had certainly assisted in them. As a consequence, he received a sentence of 28 years.
One of the forgotten victims in the whole sordid saga is the very place that has become inextricably linked to these crimes. The reality is that an old bank in a quiet country town has now in many ways become a shrine to the victims of Australia's worst serial killer.
It's such a shame that Snowtown will always be synonymous with this horrific crime, when in fact none of the people charged ever lived there, none of the victims ever lived there, and only one of the murders was carried out in Snowtown.
It's a terrible shame that Snowtown has been labelled now with this terrible stigma attached to the Snowtown murders. It is a small rural town that already was in decline, and the people there lived quiet lives and didn't need the attention of the world that they got.
People assume that the murders occurred in Snowtown. It's very unfortunate for the small community, but Snowtown is not a good name in Australia.
This is the worst case of serial killing in Australia's history. It's one of the most abhorrent and worst crimes ever committed in this country. And it's also a case that is unique globally in the fact that it was a group of killers which also preyed on itself.
The whole thing is actually, it's the stuff of horror movies. Could something like this happen again? Well, you would hope not, but human nature being as it is, it's possible.